Doug, it's so great to connect today, and I appreciate your willingness to share a few things with me this morning.
Absolutely, Nate. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to join that long list of leaders that you've had the opportunity to discuss these issues with, and there's a lot there that everybody could learn.
Well, you're certainly making this podcast better with your experience, and you've made an impact in multiple industries, from the Navy to healthcare and now in academia. And as you reflect on your career, what lessons have you learned that you would most want to pass on to others?
I think the basic tenets are independent of the industry, and I have lived several lives, I guess, if you will, through the course of my career, and it's somewhat unusual for a surgeon to find themselves in the role that I'm in. But I do think the leadership characteristics are fairly universal, independent of the industry. And I think my 18-year-old brother, when I was 15 and getting my first jobs, asked him for some advice, and he said something to the effect of, you're going to get a lot of criticism, but take it as constructive criticism. We can always get better. And I think that's really, if you unbundle that, that's a pretty profound statement for an 18-year-old kid. He went on to do extremely well in international business, but I think the concept of always being able to get better and listening to others around constructive criticism is really important. And I think really speaks to humility in the role, right? None of us know it all. None of us have the best ideas all the time. And it ties into another one of my tenets, I guess, which is listen before you speak. Um, and and um, and I think my approach, when I walk into a room of my team or whatever it is, whatever group it is, the first thing I like to do is not always usually not sit at the head of the table. It kind of freaks people out sometimes, but I move around where I sit in the room. I don't like to have a command performance. I like to just set the table of we're all equals and let's all have a conversation about whatever it is we're working on. And then I try to be the last one to speak on whatever topic it is that we're discussing or whatever challenge we're trying to address, to just get a sense of the depth of knowledge of the room. And usually the best ideas come out of that. And so that listen before you speak, I think, is really important.
So lots here that this made me think of. So I got four ideas that I'm going to share real quickly, and you can react to it. Uh, I love this idea from your brother. Take criticism, learn from it. There's this idea today that, we should be our authentic selves. And while authenticity in leadership is important in certain ways, some people take that as, I'm perfect, I don't need to change. And so one of the phrases that I really like is, in terms of authenticity, we should try to be the best version of ourselves, which means that we should continue to learn and grow and take criticism. And one thing that I learned as an academic pretty quickly was that even though I had always done well in my writing classes and thought of myself as a pretty good writer, I was blown away every time I wrote an article, and I would have my colleagues, go through it, and they would come up with, on one page, they could come up with 30 ideas, 50 ideas that made it instantly better. And so I think, anytime you go in a situation where you think you know everything, you are really shortchanging yourself, because so many people are going to have ideas that can improve what we're doing. And then maybe I'll just skip to the last one. I was thinking one of my role models, especially when I talk about creativity and leadership, is Ed Catmull from Pixar. And he wrote a book, Creativity Inc., that tried to describe how they were so successful at Pixar. And one of the things that he did is he got rid of all rectangular tables for this reason you're talking about, because when somebody's at
Yeah.
the head, it signals that, they're the most important, or that they have all the best ideas. And what they realized at Pixar was, if you really want to make an amazing film, you need everybody to contribute. And so just a simple technique they used to signal that everybody's insights were valued.
No, I think that's really true. And I think you not only shortchange the conversation but you really shortchange the organization if you take that approach of not listening and not welcoming every conversation, because you also shut down that creativity and that sharing ideas if you don't allow space for that to happen. And in the long run, I think everybody loses if that's the approach you take.
So you talk about how these lessons that you've learned are kind of independent from the industry that you're serving in. As you're leading the University of Kansas, are you thinking about these lessons explicitly every day, or these lessons you've tried to internalize? Like, what's your approach as you lead when you're trying to apply these lessons?
I think over time, a lot of these become your natural MO, and then when I walk into a room, it's not very different these days, independent of the setting I'm in. That was certainly much more intentional early on, but it's now how I operate. And actually, your team and others know that that's how you operate with time. So maybe it loses a little bit of its surprise and effectiveness that way. But I try and stay to that. There's a couple of other things that I think are pretty important as an effective leader, and one is I use the term you can't have a bad day, and it's not about having a bad day because we all have bad days, but in your role, you can't have a bad day. You have to be the leader. You have to be reliable. You have to be predictable. You don't want your team saying, "Is this a good day to go ask the boss a question?" It should always be a good day to go ask the boss a question, right? And that's also about being engaging and being friendly and being approachable, and you just can't keep people guessing. You got to be consistent in your approach to leadership, and I think you can be far more effective that way. But it takes some effort, and because we do all have bad days, but you got to put it in your pocket and walk in the door and have a good day.
So I'm really intrigued by this idea of how we learn things, hopefully integrate them into who we are, even though we might forget that we've learned them or we forget the source of where they came from. So I heard a quote once, something like, I don't remember the books I've read any more than the meals I've eaten, even though they've made me, yet they've made me the person I am. And so these lessons that you've learned, maybe you don't even remember where you learned all of them, though you did reference the one you learned from your brother. Hopefully, these things we learn. The reason I bring this up also is because, for example, on this podcast, I've interviewed more than 100 people, and I write out on my website, I share all of the different lessons people learn, and it can be hard to remember all of them. And I'll 6 months will go past, and then something will remind me of something. It's like, oh my gosh, that lesson I really liked. So even though the point is, even though maybe we don't remember all of the things explicitly, hopefully they just become a part of who we are. And then the other thing I just wanted to share too, when you're talking about, you can't have a bad day as a leader. That reminded me of something that Brian Haney said. And one of his main lessons that I just love from broadcasting was the game can be bad, but you can't be. And
Right.
so there's the idea of, I'm going to be authentic and I'm feeling terrible. So I'm going to tell my team how terrible I'm feeling. Like that's not what you need to be what the team needs, right? And
Yep.
as a broadcaster, you've got to be doing a great job regardless of the score. So I really appreciate that lesson of you've got to be the leader that the team needs, not, be authentic to how you're feeling in that moment.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Well, Doug, I really appreciate you taking the time to share these lessons. Maybe one final question as we wrap up here. Uh, Leading such a large organization with so many constituents, what's the hardest thing that you deal with on a day-to-day basis as a leader?
That's a great question, and I think in this particular role, and it's sort of everybody says, "Oh, it must be great to be the boss." But the reality is, I have more bosses right now than I've ever had in my life.
Interesting.
Right? I just have so many constituencies that care passionately about this university, or maybe not so passionately about this university. And so it is really trying to keep in mind um, who all those constituents are, and it goes for me. It goes back to um, just reminding myself, what are we trying to accomplish here? What is our North Star as an organization? And then when you think about all those constituencies, you have to put them in that context of what are we trying to accomplish? And then what does that mean to that constituent? And that could be an alum, it could be a donor, it could be the governor, it could be a state legislator, It could be obviously a student, could be the family of a student, could be a student athlete. Obviously, your faculty are huge and they're very diverse and across 5 campuses and different geographical locations and then the communities in which we work and thrive. And so trying to think about what our North Star is for our university and how that impacts each one of those constituencies, and then figuring out how to communicate that. I think is probably one of the biggest challenges of this role.
I think that's a great perspective, certainly for upcoming leaders, because it can be easy to think, the president of the United States, they're the most powerful person in the world. They can do whatever they want. And like you're saying, the higher up you go, often the more constituents, the more bosses you have, especially if you're trying to take any sort of servant approach where you're really just trying to help people rather than just throw your weight around and get your way. So. Well, anyway, Doug, really appreciate your time. This is so great for me to be able to hear these lessons from you. Look forward to sharing these with my students, and also look forward to our paths crossing soon on campus. So thank you so much.
Look forward to it, Nate. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. Great lessons to share.